Here is Helen Fitt, a board member of the ITS New Zealand. She's a lecturer at Lincoln University, and she's going to explain how electric vehicles can be part of the tourism industry. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Richard. In 1903, Horatio Nelson Jackson set out to drive a motor car from San Francisco to New York in response to a bar bet as it couldn't be done. Just 15 miles into their intended 4,500-mile journey, they blew their first tire, and they had to replace it with the only spare they brought along. Through the Sierra Nevadas, they had to move boulders out of the way by hand along a route that had never been travelled by car before. On several occasions, they had to get towed by horses, including out of the swamp they were seeking into. They went 36 hours without food, having got horribly lost. And on 2 separate occasions, they had to wait 5 days in place for spare parts to be delivered by stagecoach. They made it. It took them 64 days, and it cost them $8,000 to win a $50 bar bet. But they made it. The question is, why does this matter? It matters because I think that long distance travel has quite a lot to teach us actually about how we adopt new technologies, how we go on to use them, and how our mobility cultures evolve as we progress through time. So for example, private car ownership has over the course of about the last 130 years revolutionized the way we think about holidays and leisure. It's changed what we do with our time, and that has some quite profound implications for society in general. And if you think about how air travel has worked, again, that has changed the way that we engage with our world. So it's important that we understand this stuff going forward. And yet, the vast majority of social science research, I'm a social scientist, I look at how technology interacts with society and how they influence each other. The vast majority of social science research around electric vehicles has taken place in urban areas focused on routine travel. So there are some very good reasons for that. And we have learned a lot from it. We've actually learned quite a lot about long distance travel in EVs from research in urban areas. For example, we do know that even when we talk to people about routine travel, holidays or expectations of holidays have quite a significant influence on the kinds of vehicles that people choose to buy. We've also learned quite a lot about perceived barriers to using EVs in longer trips, including holidays. So we know quite a lot about issues around range and charging infrastructure and access to background. But there actually isn't very much systematically collected data about what happens when people take EVs on longer distance trips. I'm sure some of you in the industry have spoken to lots of people who already know a lot of this stuff. There's not very much research gone into that. And I think it's important that we do that research because if we're going to take seriously the possibility of EVs making up a substantial part of our vehicle fleet, actually we need to deal with this longer distance travel stuff. And I would argue that social scientists like me, it's time we move beyond those barriers. There are lots of EV owners out there going on longer distance trips. So it's time we move beyond investigating the barriers and look at what actually happens. So in response to that, since I was here last year, I've conducted a comprehensive review of research looking at how EVs work in tourism. And I've also been working with a group of New Zealand EV owners in small group discussions online about how they actually use their EVs in holiday travel. And I want to talk today about some of the things I've found through that research. I want to talk today about 3 things in particular. First, I want to talk about people's reflections on EV holidays, so how EV owners feel about taking their EV on holiday. I want to talk about EV holiday patterns, or how holidays change when we drive an EV instead of an ICE car. And I want to talk about EV holiday drivers, or how people drive when they get to have on the open road taking their EV on holiday. Now there is more. There is much, much more than this from the research. We're going to have time for questions, and I'm going to put I've got my email address at the end. So please feel free to ask if you want to hear me go further. We're going to be pretty quick and not very much detail today. If you want to hear more, don't hesitate to shout out. If there are topics you think I should have talked about and haven't got to again, shout out because we have to choose a few things to talk about today. Let's start though with reflections on EV holidays, or how people feel about taking their EV on holiday. It's important first of all to note that I've talked to a range of different people with a range of different perspectives. From Harriet, who said, I would love to take my EV for more trips, but the range just doesn't allow it. And Eli, who said, I can't really think of any trip that I couldn't do with the Model 3 that I could do with an ICE sedan. So I've talked to different people with different experiences and different perspectives. I don't want to imply that all EV owners feel the same way about their holidays. Like, clearly not true. But there are some common themes that come through. So it's those that I want to pull out today. And I want to start with a sense of adventure. When people talk about going on holiday in an EV, they often associate it with a sense of adventure or of being pioneering. Nothing quite on the level of Horatio Nelson Jackson, but where people describe driving an ICE car on holiday as a very ordinary, some might even say boring thing to do, people consider driving an EV to be much more adventurous and pioneering. And we've got several different kind of conceptualizations of adventure and pioneering in there. So some people talk about driving an EV in terms of a sense of risk or anxiety about things going wrong, and a sense of pride or accomplishment when they actually face up to those risks. So Hazel told me, I definitely feel adventurous and that we've achieved something getting to our destination. However, I do let my partner drive when the distance to GOL is similar, so I don't have to worry about the range. GOL, I'm sure most of you know, stands guesstimates a tongue-in-cheek reference to the range display on an EV dashboard. And what I think Hazel's doing here is she's demonstrating that there is a really fine line on holidays. It may be in a different place for different people, but a really fine line between an appealing sense of adventure and excitement and unappealing anxiety. Other people talked about that kind of pioneering just in doing something a bit different and visibly a bit different. So Toby told us, our trip in a hired e-golf, Toby does actually also own a Leaf. He hired an e-golf to get the extra range for skiing. He said our trip in a hired e-golf felt pretty adventurous as we were the only EV that ski-filled car parks. And other people again talked about this sense of adventure or pioneering in terms of being at the forefront of change. So Emma noted, I only know a handful of people through work and a few friends who actually own and drive EVs at this point. So I feel like the first time in my life, I'm an early adopter to some pretty exciting technology. So broadly speaking, our participants agreed that driving an EV has a sense of adventure and pioneering and excitement associated with it, particularly when you go out of those different areas. They did also acknowledge that that sense is diminishing and will continue to do so as EVs become more prevalent. And so we could go on there to talk about how that change in sense of adventure and associated with other things feeds into our culture of holidays and how we understand what holidays are and should be and how to get the most out of them. And we could go on here to talk about other things, including luxury or freedom. Freedom, EVs, and holidays is a particular favourite topic of mine. I don't have time to go into it now, but do feel free to ask when we get to the end if you think freedom's kind of interesting too. But I want now to move on to EV holiday patterns in the interest of time. So we could talk more about how those holiday expectations are emerging. So let's move on to how they actually happen now. When I asked participants whether their holidays in EVs are different to their holidays in ICE cars, some people told me, no, they're exactly the same, it doesn't make any difference. But by far the more common response was that going on holiday in an EV kind of slows the pace of holiday travel down. A lot of people told me they drive a little bit more slowly, especially when going beyond familiar range, to preserve that range of their vehicle. And also charging an EV takes longer than refueling an ICE car. So it puts pauses into journeys that you wouldn't otherwise have, which changes your appreciation of what you're doing. Several of the retired participants in the research said that slowing holiday travel down was fine for them. They quite liked it. So Samuel is in his 80s, and he told me, on long trips I tend to drive slower. I tend to drive about 90 kilometers an hour to avoid running out of power. This is feasible because I'm retired and seldom have any time constraints. And Michael, who's in his 60s, told me, travelling Picton to Christchurch in the ICE, I tend to stop once for up to 10 minutes at the cheapest fuel station on the way to top up. With the EV, I'm stopping about 3 times for around 20 minutes each time. As I'm retired, time is not as critical as it was when I was working. So we've got quite a clear reflection from some of these older participants that they enjoy the opportunity that retirement gives them to slow down. It's intriguing. But more intriguing, I think, is that some of the younger participants in the research seem to enjoy almost being forced to slow down by driving an EV. So Lachlan and Hazel are both in their 20s, both in separate discussion groups, haven't met each other. Lachlan said, I enjoy taking my time, and charging stops me in getting to see parts of the country I'd otherwise just drive straight through. And Hazel said, I enjoy charging en route, and this engineers a reason to stop, to explore a town or cafe or go for a brief walk, rather than just getting home as quick as possible, as you do in a petrol car. I think the intriguing thing about this is both Hazel and Lachlan could choose to stop when driving a petrol car, but they don't. They just drive straight through. So the vehicle that they're driving has actually changed the way that they engage in their holiday, and has possibly caused them to reassess what they actually value in holiday travel and what they're trying to get out of it. Several other participants told us that they were considering ditching a caravan or a camper because of the changing balance of costs between travel and accommodation. So they were saying, with an EV, they'd rather actually travel cheaply and then pay money for hotels or motels, rather than travel more expensively and stay for free in a caravan or camper. So I think the question that this causes us to ask is what we're looking for in holidays, is what we want and what we expect, influenced by the kind of vehicles we drive. And if it is, does increasing adoption of EVs feed into changing cultures of what we want in holidays? Because if it does, on a local New Zealand scale and on a global scale, that actually has some quite serious implications for how our travel, how our environment, and how our society are engaging with travel and leisure. But again, in the interest of time, I don't want to hold you up from your lunch too much. Let's move on to the next section and talk about EV holiday drivers. Most of us probably would agree that driving an EV feels a bit different to driving a nice car. And when something feels different, we often do it differently. So I was wondering what that actually means for the way that people drive cars and things like the holiday road toll, particularly in response to emerging media reports that EV drivers might be involved in more and different kinds of accidents to isolate roads. Now, there isn't a lot of evidence about this, there isn't a lot of research, but I saw this headline and I thought that's kind of interesting. So I decided to ask the participants in my research what driving their car feels like, and whether they drive it differently to the way that they would drive an ice car. And most participants, their immediate response was, when I drive an EV, I drive it more slowly and conservatively than I would drive a petrol car, mostly to the range. So we've got people like Toby, who said, I tend to drive more slowly, more speedily and slowly when in the EV. I'm just generally more aware of how I'm driving. And that was the most common immediate response. But quite a lot of participants then went on to say that there are occasions when they absolutely take advantage of the extra acceleration and torque that they have in their vehicles. So Hugo said, I don't drive faster than before. I'm a safety nut. I do enjoy the acceleration, especially when passing. And sometimes to drive it like I stole it, just because I can. There were quite a lot of similar comments. I think one of my favourites comes from Cletus. Participants were able to choose their own pseudonym. From Cletus, who used to ride superbikes in his younger days, and Cletus said, so in general, I drive a bunch slower than I used to ride, and generally I'm relatively staid. But on occasion, the urge to bogan overrides the Now, I think it's important to note here that not all EVs were created equal, and it clearly matters what kind of car someone's driving, particularly its range, to how it's driven. But I also think there's some good evidence here that we are seeing some clear and systematic differences in the way that people drive EVs compared to the way that they drive petrol cars. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying at this stage it's different. And because of this apparent dichotomy between I usually drive more carefully and more consciously, but occasionally the urge to bogan overrides judgments, it's unclear what this actually means as yet for things like holiday road toll. But while we keep focusing, while social scientists like me keep focusing our research in different areas, we don't actually get to find out about this stuff and look at how it's emerging in a way that enables us to proactively deal with it. So I would say we need to get out and start looking at some of these longer distance trips from a strategic and systematic perspective. So in summary then, there is a lot more that I could say about how people feel about taking their EVs on holiday, about how holiday patterns seem to be and could in future change as a result of switching to EVs, and about how people drive when they're driving an EV, and also about lots more stuff I don't really have time to go into today, but I would love to chat about more in the brilliant, so feel free to ask. Finally, before we finish though, where to from here? What's the point? Why does any of this stuff actually, it's entertaining, but why does it actually matter? From an advocacy perspective, if we understand these kind of issues, if we understand what actually happens when people go out on EV trips, we can try to understand how to make them more appealing and how to encourage more people to have these kinds of experiences. From an industry perspective, we can start looking at where new business opportunities might be emerging that we otherwise haven't seen, if we understand what's actually happening. And in this case, I think there might be some possibilities for closer collaboration between some elements of the EV and tourism industries. But from a research perspective, understanding this kind of stuff helps us to understand how our society is changing. And that can be quite important. We have seen very many changes in the way that our society works in the history of the automobile, and I think we're seeing more coming now. We've come a very, very long way since Horatio Nelson Jackson set out on his pioneering journey across America. Hopefully most of us haven't been stuck in sinking swaps or on dating after we don't have to move boulders out of the way by hand. But I do think that if we understand what does actually happen during long distance trips, then it will help us to understand how new technology adoption and use and our culture going forward is actually going to work. For now though, what do you want to hear about?
You can hold your way to questions. Any questions for Helen? I've got one. Every time I travel, I try to book at hotels with charging. And if they don't have it, I badger the manager to get them to install charging. Am I doing the right thing?
Sorry. It's one I've never been asked before. I would say yes. I mean, I think, you know, I've had a similar experience with my GP, actually. I ride a bicycle to my GPs, and for years I used to go to the GP and have to chain my bicycle in an inconvenient place next to the fence. And I badgered them for years for a bike rack and said, as a GP surgery, you should be sending a message to people. And finally, about a year ago, they put a beautiful bike rack in. And next time I went to see my GP, she was very proud. She said, I did it. I finally got it through the practice manager for you. I put your bike storage. So yes, I think it takes time. But yes, I think we should be sending that message. From the business's point of view, I think there are some interesting business cases to be developed about where it's useful to put them in. But I'm sure that we have people who can actually help with that.
I would say it will become like Wi-Fi was 5 to 10 years ago when you chose where you wanted to stay because you either had free Wi-Fi or you actually had Wi-Fi even if you had to pay for it. And I think now that certainly in motels, that has to be now the people driving EVs. They're happy to drive and charge fast whilst driving during the day. But why not treat a motel like you treat home and have a slow charger? It could just be an outside 3-pin plug. It doesn't have to be fancy and sexy. It just needs to be something that you're an EV driver plug into. And if you knew that that was the case, you would do that. We just recently had some feedback from some of the top 10 quality parks. We've got money from ECA to put in type 2 chargers. And it's taken David Redford, Master, and Nelson, and me, and going back to ECA on several occasions to get those plugs through. Some of them have been installed. No signage, no training, no understanding by the people who worked in those hobby parks what the hell they did, why they did it, nothing. You know, and the organisational head somewhere is going, oh, charges inside our holiday park, oh, great. But no one's using them.
And you're right, but I think, you know, I remember back the times when, you know, you go to a hotel and they say that they have internet and then you have to have your own cable and you can never get it connect properly, and you know. And now, if you turn up and it doesn't have Wi-Fi with a short password that's easy to put in, well, you can just point it because, yeah, you probably go somewhere else. Yeah.
But so there, they made the point earlier around understanding congestion of their charging. Looking at the map, there are some pressure. And if we're talking about this, the travel with the stops to slow down to the point, how would some of that charging identify where those are?
At the moment, it's very difficult. From the perspective of tourism research, I mean, unfortunately, as you say, time is not agreement. And we were talking about this.
Is it Tom still here?
Oh, Tom's still here. Well, maybe Tom can give his answer in a minute then as well. We were talking about it earlier today. I was talking to James about that. From a tourism perspective, quite surprisingly, there actually isn't any national repository data on tourism flows around the country. So obviously, we know something. We know that State Highway 1 and Queensland has a higher proportion of international visitors on it than lots of the rest. You know, we know those kind of things, and we know where international and domestic holiday makers spend their money, but we don't actually know very much about their driving patterns other than what we can extrapolate. Did you want to add anything to that, Tom?
When we can see people going on to the network, in terms of tracking hotels and things, looking at the billing for them. So if you've got a more economical hotel, then tracking is $15-20 probably quite relevant. So
So some interesting questions around data.
So on the island, we anticipated that we paid for the service. So, what's your view in terms of tourism support?
Well, I think, you know, the AA has those mobile charge facilities, but my guess is will become more popular over time. I think, you know, also there will be some opportunities to provide things like events as we go forward. I mean, flows of visitors. You know, you imagine sort of warmers over one of the little lines, the big events that we have, and then the pressure that would put all of those people driving EVs, the pressure that would put on the charging network. But all of those people aren't going to be driving EVs next year. There's going to be a massive increase, and I think the infrastructure providers are on top of that and will develop that infrastructure as we go forward. But you're right, I mean, there are going to be gaps and there are going to be places where there's needed.
So your university, for example, is there a place where somebody can bring up and get a boost?
There are EV chargers for up. I don't know what you actually need to be able to connect it. My guess is that if you knew where they were, and you know, my email address is up. You know, if you're ever in the vicinity, I don't actually know whether anybody will public.
And to push any 3-point pin as a boost, that's the joy of an electric vehicle.
No, I guess the reason I love racing is we're a trust and we can get lots of issues. But this thing is supposed to be a rescue truck has never happened. So I'm wondering if anybody has actually seen one.
I believe they've got them on trial in Wellington. But I would be surprised when it came to Waikiki, because they'll be looking for places where there's a larger amount of population. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Excellent. Right, now a little bit of